I got a call from the cause team, and they asked me to come and deliver a keynote on value. And to me, value is very subjective, right? I come from the open source community, and we don't necessarily think about value when we decide to create an open source project. We're actually just trying to solve some of our own problems. So about 8, 9 years ago, a group of people come together, primarily at Google, with some help from Red Hat. There's a lot of Red Hatters here. And they create this project called Kubernetes. And looking today, you would say Kubernetes created a lot of value, but that wasn't the mindset that we took going into this. If you would have taken the business mindset, Kubernetes would not exist. If you've ever tried to innovate in an enterprise, if the first question is, what's the business value? More than likely, most ideas will be killed immediately. The things we work on aren't about necessarily delivering business value. I know you're not supposed to say that, but typically we're working on human value. There are problems we're actually trying to solve. If you've been in infrastructure like I have for 20 years, one of the biggest challenges we've had in infrastructure, which is typically people are hired not to innovate, but to manage. Most companies have made decisions for decades, and when you get your first day on the job, these decisions are not yours. You typically inherit them. And Kubernetes, when we created that project, we were trying to solve the infrastructure problem of working at an enterprise and inheriting software. Now, depending on your team and your level of experience, you knew how to automate software. I can't believe it's been 30, 40 years and people are still trying to figure out how to put software on a server. If you think about a lot of the technology that we use, you think about a lot of the movements we have like DevOps, a lot of them are predicated on trying to solve this problem of getting software on a server so that people can realize all of the value that our developers are creating on behalf of our businesses. So Kubernetes comes out, and I look at Kubernetes not as a thing about the future, but it's a snapshot of the past. You take the last decade of innovation in the cloud for people who figured out how to deliver software, and you end up with all those patterns under one umbrella, and we call it Kubernetes. Now, when we shipped this particular open source project, there was a lot of hype behind it. Have you all seen a lot of hype in the last 5 or 6 years when it comes to technology? And part of that hype causes a bit of distraction. We started this conference called KubeCon. I don't know if any of you have ever been. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to keynote KubeCon 2018, and I gave a talk that used this hidden figures theme. And the talk was the path to serverless. It's that one day, this popular open source project will go away. And you can imagine something that only came out 5 years prior, having people who bet their lives and their careers and have linked their identity to this open source project were shocked to find one of its earliest contributors talking about its eventual demise. And I told the audience that they should be looking forward to the day that something as popular as Kubernetes would disappear. Its disappearance would represent progress, and anything that would sit on top of Kubernetes will equate to value. Anything that could allow Kubernetes to float to the bottom and rise to the top would show that we figured out a better way of solving very similar problems. Now, in that particular talk, I used this analogy or this movie as a metaphor, Hidden Figures. If you've never seen this movie, it's about the US trying to get to space or get a human into orbit and back again. And they're thinking that this is a new problem and it requires a new solution. And they spent all of this time trying to figure out new mathematical calculations to actually return the rocket back to the US safely with the human inside. And one person figures out that the answer to their problem is an old equation that they found in an old math book. See, the fundamentals are super important. And for her, she highlighted the fundamentals, and then there was a group of people who would have to implement those fundamentals. Back then, they were calling people human computers. These are people who were the human calculators. They did all of these equations by hand, and their jobs were threatened by the IBM mainframe. I don't know about you all, but anytime new technology get introduced at a company, sometimes the practitioners do feel threatened. Is this thing going to take away my job? What does my job look like in the future when this thing gets implemented? If you've been around long enough, you know none of this stuff works 100%. There's always some gray area between what the vendor sold you and what it's supposed to do. And typically, That's the value we create, the thing in the middle. And so when the team was being threatened to be replaced by the mainframe, it turns out you actually have to program the mainframe. Who are the best group of people in the world to program said thing other than the people who do that job? And so like any respectable engineer, she went and taught herself Fortran. And one of the things that we talked about at that particular conference was the need to grow the number of people who can do what the experts do. In the US, we have this phrase, and sometimes it's very inaccurate. We have the concept of a 10x engineer. Anyone has ever heard of the 10x engineer? Has anyone met a 10x engineer? Someone in here thinks they're a 10x engineer. You're probably not. My view of a 10x engineer looks like this. The person who can go back and level up the whole team to be better than they were before is definitely a 10x engineer. And it's rare in between, as the phrase goes, you can accomplish anything as long as you don't care who gets the credit. And a lot of times our egos and our identities prevent us from scaling to this particular level. So when I think about value, I think about it in those terms. Now, how is this relating to the Kubernetes conference? At that time in 2018, we had almost 30,000 people more excited about Kubernetes, the technology, than what it actually does. What is its role in the overall grand scheme of things? If you ask someone like me, the role is really, really small. And the things that you have to do above and beyond Kubernetes, that's where the value lives. I met a person at KubeCon just a few months ago in Europe, and it's the first person I met that had a Kubernetes tattoo on their arm. And I asked this person, and I was like, is that permanent? There's a chance that Kubernetes is no longer relevant in the future. And so I cautioned him that it may not be the best idea. I mean, it's too late for him, but it may not be the best idea to link your identity to these open source projects. They're just temporary checkpoints in the timeline. I'm going to end this by the way I started that Kubernetes talk. To me, my whole career, I always knew technology was a means to an end. I didn't start computers at an early age, but I did witness technology being used in the household. My mother at that time, a single mother, she was working as a seamstress in probably one of these factories where people were sewing clothes. Okay, maybe I'm 8 or 9 years old, and my mom wanted a better job for herself. And it turns out the job that she wanted required you to learn how to touch type. And part of the job interview is you would have to demonstrate that you could type at least 70 words per minute. And they asked her when she was filling out the application, can you touch type? The only thing you can do at that moment is lie. And you say yes. And I remember talking to my mom recently about this story. She said she drove to the local YMCA, or you can think of it like a library. And at that particular place, you could actually check out a typewriter and a book that could help you teach how to touch type. You don't really understand what's going on, but all you know is that your mom has a job that doesn't have regular working hours. She has to find a babysitter to get to her job on time, and she would like to change her situation and actually use technology to provide better value for her family. Now, as a kid, you come home and then you hear someone learning to type. It sounds pretty wild. If you're a developer and you work with another developer that types with one finger, that drives you insane. You're like, hey, could you slide over? I'll drive. And then over time, and I can remember sometimes being half asleep, and you hear someone getting much better at this. They can type with both hands. And they're at 85 words a minute. And she took me back to that job interview, and she asked me to just sit quietly in the seat. I sat there quietly while she proved that she could type 85 words a minute. And one day she came home at normal hour, right after I got back from school, normal business hours, all because she taught herself a new piece of technology that allowed her to control her own destiny. So the value of that technology was just a means to an end. It was just a small component, and I can't help but realize that all technology I've seen since then has always meant a means to an end for me. Now, to dive deeper into this concept of value, I'm going to invite Ivan back to the stage for a fireside chat. Thank you.